In a world of business complexity, execution is everything. This is JD and the Brain, where failure was not an option and performance isn't accidental. Let's get to work.
Welcome to JD and the Brain, the practice of business where leadership theory meets operational reality. I'm Dr. T. Wiles Fowler, author of the CEO's Stamp of Approval. And alongside my co-host, JD Cecilia, we're exploring the practical leadership behaviors that separate organizations that merely function from those that truly flourish. In every organization, leaders eventually face a critical choice. They can continue trying to be the smartest person in the room, making every decision, solving every problem, controlling every outcome, or they can make the transition to what we call the delegator mode. It isn't about abandoning responsibility, it's about multiplying leadership. It's the recognition that no leader can scale themselves, but they can scale their people. The irony is many leaders who desperately want high-performing teams unknowingly create dependency. They answer every question, they approve every action, they become the bottleneck. Their people stop thinking because the leader has trained them not to. Great leaders do the opposite. They create clarity, they establish standards, they provide support. Then they trust their people to execute, to learn, and to grow, and even to make mistakes. They shift from being the chief doer to becoming the chief developer. In the language of the STAMP framework, the delegator mode is where support creates confidence, teamwork creates trust, aptitude creates compatibility and capability, and morale creates ownership, and performance then becomes sustainable. The goal of leadership isn't to build followers. The goal is to build leaders. Today, JD and I will discuss why delegation is often a misunderstood leadership skill in business, why so many leaders struggle to let go, and how the best organizations can create a culture where responsibility is distributed, accountability is clear, and people are empowered to perform at their highest level. So grab a notebook, settle in, and join us as we explore the power and the discipline of the delegator mode. Real quick, before we dive in, let's talk about the leads continuum and where we are, so sort of a process check. So the leads continuum describes the evolution of leadership influence. First, the leader, do as I say. Next, the educator, do as I say, but here's a reason why. Then the administrator, which we looked at last week. What can I do to help you? And then today's topic is the delegator. The delegator assigns responsibility, grants freedoms within borders, and trusts people to execute. The message is clear. You're on your own for now. I'll check back later. Finally, the highest expression of service, which is next week, is the screener, and the screener removes obstacles, clears roadblocks, creates conditions for success. The question then becomes, what is in your way? The powerful insight of the leads continuum is that leadership matures from controlling people to enabling people. Less command, more capability, less supervision, more empowerment. Today, JD and I are focusing on the fourth stage of that journey, the delegator, and why so many leaders struggle to let go. JD, as I said in the 1990 commercial, Budweiser, what's up?
I love it, Tim. Listen, I really like the logical flow of the leads continuum. It really does follow a very chronological way and practical way of leadership development. It's been my experience, though, that they happen at a very rapid pace. And so you really have to learn exactly which mode you should be in, and you need to be able to shift to that mode. As you mentioned last week, we talked about administrator. Again, it's being that helpful support, that ministering to the actual future leaders. So the delegation one's really neat because I think what happens with a lot of leaders is they if they're really on top of their game, they will realize that I can't do everything by myself. I mean, that has to be a very crystal clear realization for them that what we do here, whether it's the military or civilian life, et cetera, is far more than one person can do. And that's generally why you have a leadership position, so that you can have enablers all around you with specific skill sets and whatnot to take care of some of the different aspects of what your overall mission is. So as I was thinking through getting ready for this week, I've thought about times where I had to shift into that mode. And the first couple times you do it, there's a little bit of an uneasy feeling. And then you develop this sense of whether they're ready or not to receive that type of responsibility. So the things that I've learned over the couple of years is you cannot, and I mean absolutely cannot delegate authority and responsibility separately. They have to be one and the same. If you're going to delegate responsibility for something to get done or accomplish some task, you also have to give them the authority to make decisions about it, particularly in project work. I've been in situations where senior leaders had developed their subordinate leaders and they said, I trust you because I've seen you work over time. So I'm going to delegate the responsibility to you, but I'm also going to give you the scope of response and authority that's required to get it done. So that's the first thing that I think we should talk about is the combination of delegation of responsibility and the requisite authority to get it done.
Well, that's an excellent point. And I think as we go back to the statement in the book, it sort of says, hey, you're on your own, but I'm going to check back later kind of a thing. So there's sort of that, I'm going to give it ownership, but there's going to be boundaries around that ownership. So excellent point. So delegation is not dumping, it's structured empowerment. What delegation actually means, matching responsibility with clarity, letting go without losing control. So that's kind of to your point. Some key points around the delegator. Delegation without clarity creates rework. Trust is built through defined expectations, and leaders must release control strategically. So it needs to be a part of a larger plan. Could be a succession plan, it could be a strategic plan, it could be an operational plan, but it should be a part of an overall strategy. And the takeaway here is that you don't lose control by delegating. You lose control by delegating poorly. Have you had any poor delegators in your life over the years, or did you
Oh,
make
yeah.
mistakes early on?
I think anybody who's been in any profession for any amount of time has probably had someone who delegates poorly. One example comes to mind is when they realize too late that they can't do it by themselves, and so time is now your enemy. Had you been delegated this responsibility with the full scope of time, you could have accomplished it easily. But as you said, it's like dumping it on someone at the last minute, and then you're responsible for the outcome. That has happened once or twice in my life. And I said, I'm going to learn from this. And that is, I will never do this to somebody else. So sometimes really a poor delegator helps develop your own sense of what the right way to do it is. So you make sure you don't do it. So that's the first thing that came to mind was given the task, the responsibility, delegated responsibility way late in the process so that you have less time to do what you needed to do. And we could talk about the other one too, about scope of authority, but you mentioned it in your introduction is that those controls, that control, its authorities, how they all kind of blend together. What level of control does the person have? What decisions can they make? I've had both examples where, as a project leader, my sponsor said, yeah, do it, and you have the authority to make decisions for it. I've also had leaders who said, you're responsible, but you need to come to me for decisions. And what that does is it slows everything down because they're not always readily available. Senior leaders have full calendars. And so everything slows down. The momentum starts to slow down. So you're at the table making the conversations about what's next. And they say, all right, well, I've got to run it up to the boss before we can do this. And so everybody just kind of sighs and goes, oh, brother, here we go again. Another week of lost time, essentially trying to get the decision. So those are the kind of bad examples that I've had in my life that said, I'm not going to do that.
So I was thinking as you were talking, we didn't really get a chance to explore this point that General Day made a couple episodes ago about that one a senior leader that his goal was to make only one decision a year. Do you remember General Day
Yeah.
saying that? And I was thinking, what a mature approach to leadership that they recognize that their team is strong enough for me to just make one decision a year. And he had mentioned that, the board wasn't really too keen on that because they weren't so trusting of with his team. And I always thought that that was an interesting kind of a goal to shoot for, kind of work yourself out of a job. In the lean business, the continuous improvement business that you and I have been in and are in, our goal was to basically work ourselves out of a job. So if you think about operations responsibility. When you first start, it's kind of small, but then as you start to grow, their responsibility starts to grow. And then we start off as the consultant, having a high responsibility of things. And then over time, ours minimizes. So that dance, that relationship is about delegation, greater responsibilities.
Well, I think the scope of the responsibilities as you climb the rungs to higher levels of responsibilities, it necessitates delegation because you clearly can't do it. If you think at any organization that has, over 100 people, there's no way they can manage 100 people at the individual level. I've heard studies said that the scope of responsibility for number of those that work for you is about 12. So use that as just a planning figure. I know the government uses that number for deciding when they need a supervisor level position is do they have 12 subordinates? So that justifies a leadership position. So think of those like General Day, he was a defense logistics agency who had thousands of people. So obviously he was really trying to get to the point to where he really didn't need to make a lot of decisions every day.
Well, there was somebody 2,000 years ago that had 12 disciples, so maybe there's something to that kind of a thing. So that's a good segue. I'm going to bring in an older example of a strong leader that the world would perceive as a strong leader. And he learned some things to become a strong manager. And then ultimately he became a better leader. So this whole false dichotomy of leader versus manager thing, I think that's a narrow view of reality. I think in order to be a good leader, you should also know how to be a good manager. So I think there's a blend to that as opposed to some false dichotomy. So back in the day, Exodus chapter 18 was a man named Moses. And we all know the story as he led the children of Israel out of Egypt. And his father-in-law was named Jethro. And Moses had this great victory. He got all the people into the wilderness. And now, dad was coming, the father-in-law was coming. And so let's just read a couple of those verses here of how Moses learned to become even though he was a great leader, he learned to manage people and manage things, and he became even a better leader. So now Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, heard everything God had done for Moses and for the people, and how the Lord had brought them out of Egypt. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other, and they went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done, with Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things and the rescuing from the hands of the Egyptians. He said, "Praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians and from Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hands of the Egyptians." So the next day, it was sort of take your father-in-law to work day. So Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all those people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered them, "Because the people came to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions." Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you're doing is not good. You and these people who come here, you wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You can't handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some good advice, and may God be with you. Appoint several leaders to serve as judges for the people at all times, to handle most cases, but have them bring the most difficult ones to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make the load lighter because they share it with you. And if you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain. And all these people will go home satisfied. They won't be standing around all day. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He chose the capable and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, some over hundreds, some over 50s, and some over 10s. They always served as judges for the people. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. And commentator T. Desmond Alexander, kind of an ancient researcher, says that the example of Moses delegating authority to others is a fitting reminder that within church and society at large, we need to share tasks so that no single individual is unduly burdened. Those in position should be prepared to entrust others with appropriate and meaningful responsibilities.
I think the numbers vary, but it was in the millions of the people that he was leading across the wilderness there. Can you imagine and I've been in some big operations before, never with millions of people, but I can't imagine just the logistical trail and requirements to support that. and they had to move frequently. It wasn't like they could settle for a week or a month or whatever. They moved constantly. And he was taking on the responsibility of everything from food, water, probably order of march, probably all those things that what he was really charged to do was lead people, not bog yourself down with the logistics of getting all these people to the next location. And I'm surprised he lasted as long as he did. I mean, he couldn't, I don't think he had time to sleep. And then he was settling differences between people for the smallest of infractions up to the more, serious ones, night and day, tonight to day. I was like, yeah, just reading that thing made me tired listening to it. It's a perfect story to talk about delegation.
Yeah. So in healthcare, we want providers to work at top of license. We want them to work, we want the surgeons to work on complex surgery, and we want, physician assistants to work on the type of level things that they have as well. And each person has their role and responsibility. So Moses was working below his license. He was fixing disputes over, domestic issues or whatever. So he was not working at top of license, and so the father-in-law had Moses's best interest in mind. So
Yep.
how many times do our family members have our best interests in mind? My kids, they're all kind of perfectionists, and I would say to them, hey, life's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You got to take your time. There's going to be times of rest and there are going to be times of struggle, and, just be patient and hang in there. So I tried to bring that, let other people carry some of the burden with you as well. How about your family?
Yeah, as soon as you started talking about family members, a brother came to mind, and we're close in age, 18 months apart. So we went through, high school and together and double dated, played on the same football team, all that kind of stuff. And then when I went in the military and was gone for 20 plus years, and in the meantime, he started farming in addition to his other job. And while he was a younger man, he could cut and bale hay and pick up hay, and he runs a couple dozen horses and all kinds of stuff. He could do all of that. And and for the last 5 years, I've told him, I said, listen, you need to cut back on this farming. I mean, it is taking up every extra moment that you have. And he doesn't need to farm. He farmed originally because he liked it and because he was providing hay for his horses. But it got to be like one of those kind of things where everything was stressful because you got to cut the hay at a time when you don't think it's going to rain. And then if it does rain, you got to turn it. And then if your hay bales get wet, you got to let them dry out. So everything all summer long became this really stressful time for him. So I finally convinced him this year to separate his hay fields into pastures and just rotate his horses through the pastures, and just kept one field for hay. And last year we did it, and I had like 5 guys come help, and it took us 3 hours to do the entire hay field. We were done. We had that many people working. We were just round robin on those things, right? And then he told me that just recently, like this week, he said, since I've cut back, my back has started to feel a lot better. I'm not as grumpy as I used to be. So yes, absolutely. I said, listen, it makes no difference to me what you decide to do, but I'm just looking at you from a health perspective, and you're killing yourself with all this extra work, and you don't need to. I mean, you're well off enough that you've worked all your life. You've got everything covered. So cut back on some of your farming, and I think you'll feel a lot better.
All right. So I'm gonna start calling you Jethro. You helped Moses, reduce the work on the field. So I can remember a time when I experienced being delegated to, and then I took that and delegated to other people, and it worked. It worked. So I was with Ford Motor Company, and we talked about this before, the integrated system review and the encyclopedia of things that the folks needed to do. And the one plant that I was assigned to was a very profitable plant for Ford. And they were the last of 27 domestic plants in this whole game of continuous improvement or the Ford production system. They were dead last. Basically, they had a fat wallet and they didn't really see the need for it, kind of a thing. So I was sent there by my manager. His name was John, and he was my manager for about 4 years when I was up in Dearborn. And he was an amazing, I don't see him much these days, but we're still connected on LinkedIn. But John was an amazing manager. He ran the Ford Production System assembly plant's office, and he basically called me into his office and said to me, okay, big boy, go over there at that Wixom plant and talk to them Lincoln guys, and let's get them to do this Ford Production System thing. and I know you could do it. You're on your own there, big boy. So he appealed to my testosterone, I guess. I don't know, I don't know what it was, but he whatever he said motivated me to, well, okay, I'm gonna move them from last to first. I'm gonna do everything I can to get them from last to first. So I got there and I had a pretty serious meeting with the plant manager, and I said, this Ford production system thing and this integrated system review, I can't muscle it. You can't muscle it. We're going to have to get champions for each of the 10 elements. And we're going to need a management champion, and we're going to need a UAW champion. They're going to be co-champions together. So this is not a management thing, or it's not just a union thing. It's a collaborative thing. So we need 20 people to head up each element. We call them vertical teams. And so I was able to, put some elders in place, so to speak, like Moses did around the Ford production system. And I said, you guys are the vertical champions. You are the standard setter for your element of the 10 elements. So as you start to set that standard, remember, we've got a certain number of departments that need to apply that standard, and we'll call them horizontal champions. But you 20 vertical champions, you set the standard, and then you've got to help them to apply not only your element, but the other 9 elements horizontally. So the structure that we talked about last week drove that behavior, which ultimately brought that blame-free culture at the Wixom assembly plant. And we got the highest grade in the world easily because we distributed the love, so to speak, amongst those 20 leaders. So that's my example. How about you? Any examples that didn't work for you?
Well, I could tell you some that I was involved in that didn't work, but it wasn't because I didn't delegate. I learned early on how not to do that. And so a couple of times, though, I've had bosses where they didn't delegate. They delegated responsibility but not authority. And then, as you mentioned earlier about, I'll be there to check, and they were checking way too often. Again, micromanagement. We talked about that in one of our previous episodes, is that's one of the things you learn not to do when you have one. And so I've had several of those in my different career paths, and I vowed never to be that micromanager. Give the responsibility, delegate responsibility and authority, and then get your hands off of it so that they can learn. And again, part of that has to do, and you mentioned it in your introduction about trust. When you develop the trust with your team, there's a lot of things you don't need to go over every single time you give a delegation. They already know the standards and the structure that you expect. So trust goes a long way with delegation. If leaders have trust in their subordinates that are working for them and have seen them in the past, it really can be a hands-off environment. And I'll tell you, in the hands-off environment, which what you just described, when your boss said, big boy, go fix it, he didn't give you any more guidance than that, right? I mean, you didn't need any more guidance than that. In fact, if he would have given you more guidance, it would have been a little too much because he already knew that you knew what you were doing. And so when you have that kind of a relationship and trust, delegation is second nature.
As I look, 2 decades later, some of those vertical champions really grew in the whole continuous improvement business and have run programs like that in larger organizations since then. So I think the delegator approach at that point really started to help drive, like I said earlier, you can't scale yourself, but you can scale your people, and that was pretty cool. So what you mentioned is a good lead into our leader shout out for the week. Brene Brown, she says that, so the thought is that delegation requires clarity. And here's her quote: "Clear is kind, unclear is unkind." Have you had some leaders in your life be unclear to you about expectations?
Well, I think early on that may have occurred, but when those had what I would consider less than optimal outcomes, I made sure that even if my boss wasn't clear, I asked clarifying questions. And the first thing I always ask is, what is the measure of success? I want to know in your own words what you consider good looks like. Like, what would you say you met the mark or you didn't make the mark? And so the very next question is, what are we measuring? It gets back into continuous improvement. What are your metrics? What are the leading and lagging indicators that are going to tell you whether or not you did a good job or not? So the first couple of times it may have seemed like I was interrogating them, but I really just wanted clarity, because when I walk out of here, I know exactly what you want, how you want it, what it should look like, and what good is, and what success is, and what we're measuring. A quick example of that is I had an interrogation platoon at one point in my company, and I wanted to know from my commander, I said, well, they've not done well up to this point. What are the measures that you want to see really improved? And one of them was the Defense Language Proficiency Test, the DLPT. And it's a DoD-wide measurement, or linguists go to school in the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and they get tested. And, like a 3.3 is like excellent. So when we were getting ones on 1s and 1.2s and 2.1s and things like that, hardly anybody had 3.3s. And so I said, that's what you're going to be measured on? Not a problem. So we went back and I basically just looked at the process that was in place and said, this is not going to be that hard to fix, but it's going to take a lot of diligence of making sure we follow the structure. And at the end of it, we had the highest DLPT scores on average of the entire European contingent over there with the linguists. So that kind of stuff is what the subordinate needs to really clarify. What does good look like? What are you measuring me on? What are the metrics that we're going to collect? And then that takes, like you said, clarity, or clear is kind. It's a lot better.
Well, that's excellent. So that leads us into kind of a higher level review of the CEO stamp of approval. Basically, we asked 4 questions in order to get to that lagging indicator of performance. You mentioned leading indicators and lagging indicators. So a leading indicator would kind of be the temperature of the oven at Quiznos and the speed of the conveyor belt as it's making the sub go through the oven there. And then the outcome metric, the lagging indicator, would be good tasting sandwich. There are not a lot of Quiznos around left, but that's always a good example of leading and lagging indicators. So the 4 questions we asked in the stamp of approval is, how do I lead? Okay, and that's the leads continuum that we're going to wrap up next week. How do I place people? Thirdly, how do I grow? How do I develop? And then fourthly, how do I relate? So if we can lead with wisdom, place with robustness, train with commitment to our team members, and then help people relate and grow in their teams and their group dynamics, if we can do those 4 things well, performance will be the lagging indicator. It'll be the byproduct. So, JD, we're going to wrap this up. Any final thoughts for the Delegated Week from you, sir?
I think of all of the different modes, delegation may be the one that's hardest to learn. And it's probably just because of trust. If you haven't been in an organization long enough to where you can really trust those that you're delegating authority, you're really reluctant to let it go. So I think of all of them, that's the one that takes a lot of time, the time to develop the trust.
All right. Well, before we close, we're going to leave you with the 4. It's JD and mine approach to engaging leaders who are serious about execution. 1, the book, The CEO Stamp of Approval. It's a performance operating system built to align leadership, talent, and teams. You can get it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold. There's also an audio version that's out there that's pretty cool, since most of the book is a fictional story around 4 leaders. So we would encourage you to order a copy of that. That'll sort of tie everything in together of how it all fits together. Number 2, JD and I, we run executive sessions. We don't just run retreats. We try to drive momentum. 3, we have academic partnerships, bridging leadership theory to real-world application. Students actually love the book because it's a fictional story and the professors appreciate the rigor that supports it. And then 4, thought leadership, advancing how organizations overcome inertia and friction. Because performance doesn't happen by accident. It's built through support, teamwork, aptitude, and morale. If you're serious about results, start with the book and then contact us. Our website is businessleadership.com. Go to the bottom of the page where you can connect with the contact button or call us at 440-728-HELP. Let's get to work.
Tim, what are we going to do next week?
Same thing we do every week, sir, trying to take over the business world by bridging theory to real-world execution. All right, we'll see you next week. Thanks for joining JD in the Brain.
Support the mission. Align your team. Build capability. Leverage Teaming Plus for alliances. Because performance doesn't happen by accident. This has been JD and the Brain.